Thank you so much, Azfar sir and Afsan sir, for joining us. Dear audience, coming up now is the exciting plenary lecture and performance by Professor Azfar Hussain from Grand Valley State University, Michigan. This session, titled Our Language Movement of 1952, Some Conceptual Constellations and Unresolved Questions, will be chaired by Professor Afsan Chaudhuri, Bangladeshi Liberation War researcher, columnist, and journalist. So I request Professor Afsan Chaudhuri to introduce Professor Azfar Hussain and kindly initiate the session, please. Thank you.
Many thanks. I think it's pretty relevant to introduce Azfar in a session like this. He's known to all of us. Let us say that he's been an academic who has challenged some of the major ideas which have remained unchallenged. And he's been able to bring in a new perspective and idea to these old issues, many of which are never discussed. And I think that is a major problem in our society is intellectual history, which is that we do not discuss the ideas that confront us. So the attitude is to an extent that of religion. We see them as sacred. So Azfar's presentation today should be something where he discusses the sacred from a critical point of view. So I think that is why, from an intellectual history's perspective also, it is very significant. I have known him for so long that I've even forgotten for how long I have known him. So that is beside the point. So I welcome Azfar to let us be enlightened.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and nocturnal greetings from Allendale, Michigan. Oh, no, it's past midnight here in Michigan now. So not nocturnal, but matutinal greetings, if you will be more appropriate. And thank you, Professor Afsan Chaudhuri, for that introduction. It's a short one, but I hope I can live up to your expectations. And I should also point out here that I feel very honored and humbled in your company. And of course, we have a history of our own history of relationship. And when I was younger, let me put it this way, you encouraged me a lot to write. In fact, my first column called The Journey of Mr. B that appeared in Dhaka Courier was because of you. In fact, you introduced me to Firdaus Bhai at that point, and then Firdaus Bhai said, oh, Afsan Bhai has introduced him, so he will be able to write. So I started writing, and that was my first column actually in my life. I just couldn't resist mentioning this here. So thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. And I should also point out at the outset that what you are going to hear today is but a tiny segment of an otherwise large ongoing project. And as you have just come to know that, the title of my talk is The Language Movement of 1952, Some Conceptual Concerns, not constellations here, and Unresolved Questions. So the title has slightly changed. And I told Tausif earlier that there would be no performance, so it will be a plenary talk. And so that's the way it is. So the title is that now, some conceptual concerns and some unresolved questions. And I have three short epigraphs to my talk. The first one is from a Bengali poem by Sanaul Haq, and I quote, Je bhashai ajanma ma daki, shapno dekhi, kobita likhi, bhalobashi ar gan gai, she bhasha tui kede nibi, she bhasha tui kede nibi, amar mukhe pedi dibi, tor durashar mukhe chai, unquote. Now, my second epigraph is constituted by a statement made by the Italian Marxist revolutionary Antonio Gramsci, and I quote Gramsci here, every time the question of language surfaces, it means that a series of other problems are coming to the fore, unquote. And the last one is from the Caribbean anti-colonial revolutionary Frantz Fanon, a short statement. I quote, to speak a language is to take on a word, a culture, unquote. And if I Gramscianize Fanon and Fanonize Gramsci in turn, then I can also maintain that the question of language is more than linguistic as such, that it is simultaneously social, political, and cultural, and that it is even an over-determined and over-determining site of anti-colonial and class struggles both. I will return to these interconnected Gramscian, Fanonian, conceptual nodes later. Now let me begin to make some general observations about our language movement of 1952, in the process of which, of course, I will critically interrogate as and when needed certain standard or official narratives and accounts of our language movement 1952, characterized as they are by the violence of erasures and elisions. In fact, I have learned this process of questioning from our own award-winning historian, Professor Afsan Chaudhry, our Afsan Bhai. Of course, as I've already argued elsewhere, our middle class, soggy, sentimental nationalism continues to celebrate the language movement of 1952 on February 21st, Ekushe February, that is, in its own ways on a yearly basis, erasing, obscuring, and even occulting the sites of actual material contradictions and antagonisms that involve, among other things, the questions of class and gender, for instance. This routine celebration also continues to evacuate the Ekushe of its radical content and emancipatory politics. Also, given the ways in which our mainstream political culture has evolved since the birth of Bangladesh as a nation state, a political culture decisively characterized by anti-people, anti-democratic, and even fascist, neo-fascist elements today, the Dhaka-centric yearly celebration of the Ekushe repeatedly reveals how it is reduced to a narrow cultural event, as if this language movement of 1952 has nothing to do with the emancipatory aspirations and struggles of the oppressed in Bangladesh. But Ekushe February is more than a historical moment. Of course, it was a historical moment, but it is more than a historical moment. In other words, this moment, within quote marks, I submit, cannot be seen in isolation from the entire history of mass movements, peasant movements, workers' movements, and even indigenous peoples' rebellions and resistances indeed in East Pakistan. In fact, running against the grain of standard or official narratives and accounts while drawing on the Marxist revolutionary Badruddin Umar's monumental, unparalleled, decisively people-centered, 3-volume historical study of a language movement called Purbo Banglar Bhasha Andolon or Tatkalin Rajniti. In English translation, the language movement in East Bengal and contemporary politics, the first volume of which appeared in 1970, the second one in 1976, and the third one in 1981. So drawing on that particular study, one can certainly trace the history of our language movement earlier than 1952, at least as far back as 1947, 1948. But to be historically faithful, it is precisely at that post-partition or post-independence conjuncture in Pakistan that the initial waves of resistance to its ruling classes came from peasants, from workers, from Adivashis or indigenous peoples. And however outrageous it may sound to some mainstream partisan historians today, from communists themselves, their internal differences and tactical pitfalls and subsequent failures notwithstanding. Indeed, our standard or official or middle class historical narratives of the language movement of Bangladesh, which was by no means a one-off event, both reveal and conceal. Surely they keep revealing the roles of certain leaders and individuals again and again, important and even heroic as they are. Of course, they're important, they're heroic, but those historical accounts in many instances also remain suggestively silent about the roles of the genuinely oppressed, women, peasants, and workers, among others, for instance. Indeed, Indeed, without their protracted struggles, their insurrections, their uprisings, and their sacrifices at various levels and various times, the language movement of 1952 would not have gathered momentum, nor even Bangladesh itself would have come into being as a distinct nation state in 1971. Although I do not see a one-to-one linear and mechanically or straightforwardly causal correspondence between 1952 and 1971, given that it was the totality of multiple contradictions emerging from 1947 to 1970 that forged the path to our national liberation movement of 1971. But the true protagonists of both our language movement of 1952 and our liberation movement of 1971 were common, ordinary, within quote marks, common, ordinary people themselves, the majority of whom were peasants and workers, while of course the participation of women and indigenous peoples and ethnic minorities were remarkable, to say the least, at this point. In fact, history writing itself, as Professor Afshan Chaudhry also points out, in different contexts, on different registers, history writing itself continues to remain a battlefield of conflicting and competing interests and appropriations and representations, even a site of class struggle, while absences, silences, and gaps in the writing of our history are by no means politically and ideologically neutral or innocent. In my reckoning then, the challenge for us continues to reside in recuperating and reclaiming the radical character and content of our language movement. But recuperation here does not come to mean a simple return to the past. In fact, there is no such return. We cannot simply return to 1952 or to a temporal horizon preceding it, the times that historically paved the way for the singular eruption of the 1952 movement as such. But then one may rediscover and even reload the significance of the 1952 movement in response to our contemporary conjuncture itself, a conjuncture of which we can hardly make sense without paying critical attention to actually existing unequal production relations and power relations that characterize the practice of everyday life in Bangladesh, for instance. Keeping this in mind, then, I intend to zero in on certain questions and even conceptual concerns that remain relatively, I won't say that they're totally unaddressed, relatively unaddressed in our standard accounts of the language movement of 1952, by now numerous as they are. But before I do that, I think I would do well to cite a relatively recent piece called Language for Liberation, the Class Struggle Behind 21 February, written by Nafis H., a writer based in Philadelphia, a piece that I find pretty useful because it's written with an eye on those sites and subjects and scenes that remain relatively invisible to the Bengali middle class and the ruling classes, of course. As Nafis H. puts it bluntly, I quote, "Today, as Bangla risks erasure, violence against non-Muslim minorities rises, and Adivashis or indigenous people struggle to maintain their existence. It bears remembering that 21 February stands on the sacrifice of not only Bengalis, but also Adivashis. Furthermore, the history of class struggle behind the language movement will remain as stark reminders of the shared struggle," unquote. And Badruddin Umar is right here when he maintains that the language movement of 1952 did not occur suddenly, and that the socioeconomic and political basis for it was surely in the process of becoming since 1947. Well, now, owing to time constraints, I will quickly chart out some broad contours while leaving out even some necessary detail here, but I hope the points will be emerging. I mean, I'll be able to make some general points here. First, soon after the formation of Pakistan in 1947, it became, and we know this is no news, we know this, it became abundantly clear that its eastern wing, called East Pakistan, now known as Bangladesh, turned out to be a genuine internal colony of West Pakistan that governed, regulated, and dominated the political economy of the production and distribution of resources at more levels than one, such that the disparities between the two wings became nothing short of glaring. Just to give a couple of quick examples here. Before the language movement of 1952, West Pakistan had developed 22 times more electric distribution than East Pakistan. Healthcare spending, just to take one example, was rapidly declining in East Pakistan, while the revenue collected by the central government was rarely invested back in the region. An overseas economic survey conducted by Britain at this time showed that almost 99% of foreign aid from the US, New Zealand, Australia, and France was used for development projects in West Pakistan. Then Nafis H's own account, bolstered by Umar's empirical, analytical, theoretical, and historical study, tells us that between 1947 and 1952, multiple crises variously and even notoriously affected East Bengal. Then East Pakistan, food shortages in almost every major district, corruption among government officials, and collusion with jute middlemen, the majority of whom were non-Bengalis, skyrocketing prices of daily necessities, smuggling, and the flagrant dearth of non-agrarian jobs. In Sylhet in particular, the food crisis degenerated into famine, as the government, which had forced farmers to sell their paddy at low prices, failed to provide rice to the starving masses at an affordable price. Then there was the salt crisis. Salt crisis, we don't talk about this these days, so I'm just bringing this back. Then there is this salt crisis between 1950 and 1951. The Government Salt Control Act prohibited salt imports from India, ignored salt production abilities in various parts of East Bengal, and forced it to buy salt produced in Karachi. That led to a 200-fold increase in the market price. One can certainly go on and on, lengthening this particular crisis narrative, important as it is. But one crucial political economic point needs to be made here, that by 1948 and 1949, 1.33 billion rupees had already moved out of East Bengal to India as a consequence of the partition. Now, I should add to this narrative an account of certain, if not all, movements and uprisings and rebellions that took place prior to 1952 within the internal colony or neo-colony, namely East Bengal. Very quickly then, the exemplary trinity of the movements, if you will, can be mentioned here. Movements that already showed how poor peasants, Hindu and Muslim, both indigenous peoples and communists came together and agitated together against the zamindari, jotdari system, and by extension against the ruling classes. These movements, for instance, include this well-known Tevaga Andolan or movement of 1946-47 following the famine of 1943, the famous Nachol Bidroho or rebellion of 1949 and 1950, and the Hajong Bidroho or rebellion of 1949-1950. Owing to time constraints, again, I cannot get into the details of these movements here, but I'll make a few points quickly and categorically. As for the Nachol Rebellion in particular, here is one quick but reliable account, and I quote here, the Nachol Rebellion closely followed the end of the Tevaga Andolan, where peasants in the Rajshahi division, I come from Rajshahi myself, just couldn't help saying this, in the Rajshahi division of East Bengal rebelled under the leadership of the Shautal activist Matla Shordar and communist leaders Ramen and Ila Mitro. And not only Ila Mitro, but a number of women were also communists at this point. Centered around the Nachol Thana, the rebellion started in March 1948, and the well-organized peasants, Hindu, Muslim, and Shautal, were able to take the Juddars by surprise, unquote. This movement seemed to succeed initially, but it was subsequently brutally repressed by the Pakistani government. Indigenous Shautal activists were brutally tortured by the police, while communist Ila Mitro herself was imprisoned and violently tortured. Parenthetically, I can't just resist saying that I myself wrote in Bangla about the Nachol Rebellion, a poem about the Nachol Rebellion in my mid-20s. and some lines come to mind, which I provide here in English translation very quickly. Remember Ghashura, remember Chondipur, Kendua, Rautara, Jagdai, Dharol, Shampura, and Napitpara. Remember those villages that rose in rebellion. Remember the sunlit eyes of those indigenous peasants in the middle of the epic of the autumnal harvest. Remember, unquote. Now, I just quoted myself. Now, as for the Hajong Rebellion, it was quite an insurrection by the indigenous people, Hajong people who were predominantly peasants. These people lost their lands in the Moymanching district to the British through the Garo Act, Hills Act of 1869, and were forced into serfdom under what is called the Tonka policy, whereby the zamindar decided the amount of tax to be paid in crops, which remained fixed regardless of production, and which increased annually, thus binding the peasants into transgenerational debt. Time and again, the Hajong people rose up. Time and again, the Hajong people rose in rebellion against this policy, but time and again, they were also variously and violently repressed. But during the period between 1949 and 1950, communists and Adivashis came together with unprecedented force against the Pakistan government that, of course, increasingly used violent and vicious tactics, as Nafis H. again points out, and I quote, in July 1949, 500 soldiers surrounded Jagoripara village in Kalmakanda and killed 40 residents as they were sleeping. In the same month, police arrested 50 peasant activists and tortured 7 of them to death. Despite such losses, the Hajongs remained resolute, taking up the slogan, Jaan Devo, Tabu Bhat Devo Na. Of course, the Hajong women also played their remarkable role, speaking of which one can underline the role of Kumudini Hajong and Jadumoni Hajong, and it was Roshmani Hajong was the first woman to be brutally killed, and then Ashiamoni Hajong and Bhadramoni Hajong were both arrested and then imprisoned for long, 12 years, unquote. Besides organizing peasants, the communists also played a significant role in building up militant trade unions, which later on failed. Of course, communists themselves failed, but I'm speaking of a particular historical moment here. Significant role in building up militant trade unions among East Pakistan railway workers and spinning mill workers. As Umar further shows us, workers in East Pakistan were quickly disillusioned with this whole idea of Pakistan. According to one account, and I quote again, led by communists, workers staged 26 strikes and walkouts within a very short period between August 1947 and December 1947, with more than 12,000 workers participating, unquote. So I have hitherto very quickly offered some historical examples, but the point I've been meaning to make is a very simple one, a simple point that doesn't get taken up often today, doesn't get taken up that much, which is this: without peasant and indigenous resistances and rebellions and mass agitations, even led by the communists, particularly during 1947 and 1950, it would not have been possible for the language movement to range beyond the boundaries of the middle class and intellectuals. And for that matter, it would not have been possible for the mass movement to take place immediately following the events of 21 February 1952. But true. 21 February marks a watershed moment. We know this watershed moment in our history, when thousands of students assembled in front of the old arts faculty building of Dhaka University, shouting slogans like Rashtra Bhasha Bangla Chai, we demand Bangla as the state language, and later disobeyed Section 144. The police eventually opened fire and killing 5 students and injuring many more. As a Bangla poem by Hassan Hafizur Rahman succinctly put it once, and in my quick translation, just one line: Bangla was written in blood in 1952. Indeed, the students themselves gave a conjunctural but decisively fierce voice to the language movement. But it quickly morphed into a people's movement, as Umar's work rigorously reveals. Language itself turned out to be a site of class struggle. In fact, the movement would not have been possible without the extensive participation of peasants and workers. And the movement increasingly assumed a liberationist, emancipatory character, while the very anti-colonial ethos of our language movement was also evident right from the beginning, as the movement confronted and combated what I wish to call linguistic colonialism. Indeed, to put it mildly, most of the accounts in question tend to leave out or short circuit, for instance, the question of the relationship between language and colonialism itself. Thus, those accounts end up eliding the relationship between decolonization and democratization. And of course, they are constitutively incapable of addressing the question of the total emancipation of the majority of ordinary people, women, peasants, and working class peoples, as well as ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities in Bangladesh. Indeed, the question of language itself remains unresolved in our history. As we'll see, in my work, I've been arguing for quite some time now that land, labor, language, again, land, labor, language, and the body continue to constitute the four material sites of both oppression and opposition for the global oppressed, as well as for the oppressed in Bangladesh. I've also argued that without the emancipation of these four sides of the oppressed from the four global systems of oppression and exploitation, such as capitalism, colonialism/imperialism, racism, and patriarchy, profoundly and variously, if not always unproblematically interconnected as they are, there is no real emancipation of humanity. Even a genuine democratic struggle, or for that matter, any anti-imperial or anti-colonial and anti-patriarchal struggle in a third world, within quote marks, in a third world country, cannot but be concerned with those four sites I have just named. I'm aware that I've advanced here a very fairly broad and quick formulation, although this is not the place to go into the detail of what I wish to call the land, labor, language, body problematique in Bangladesh. I wish to make a few general observations about those sites before I take up the language question, and in particular in a admittedly relatively limited context. I think it's not difficult to see the validity of this formulation in question in the case of people's ongoing struggles in Bangladesh at a time when, for instance, the safety and security and even sovereignty of our own homeland are already at stake, given the ways in which our own ruling classes operate in well-orchestrated class cahoots with transnational corporations and US imperialism on the one hand, and with such international financial institutions as the World Bank and the IMF on the other, to say the least. Of course, the land question is a loaded and complex one that, for instance, brings up the issue of inordinately and increasingly asymmetrical class-divided access to the land in our rural areas and elsewhere, as well as the question of the notorious subjugation and even occupation of our minorities' land at more levels than one within the country. Indeed, it is possible to address the land question at numerous levels to see, among other things, how the land itself turns out to be an explosive site of class struggle too. One needs to think of the ongoing struggle of the tea workers in Sylhet, for instance, ones who are still fighting over their land in the first place. As for the labor question in Bangladesh, rightly characterized by the Egyptian political economist Samir Amin, who died relatively recently. Samir Amin, as the periphery of the periphery under global capitalism, remains a site whose workers, particularly women workers, are currently among the most exploited in the entire world. In fact, a couple of months ago, there was a great study of this that appeared in Monthly Review from the United States, And so they remain one of the most exploited ones, in the entire world, despite the official narratives of progress. But labor is no unitary thing in Bangladesh. While there has been an unprecedented proletarianization within quote marks again of the masses in the country, not in the classical sense though. No matter what the state of our labor movements remains. Under such circumstances, then, the laboring body, to use the contemporary French Marxist philosopher of language, Jean-Jacques Lasarkel's materialist category, remobilized from David McNally's crucial book called Bodies of Meaning, in addition to what Lasarkel classifies as the biological body, I quote, the biological body, the phenomenological body, even the erotic body, and the social body, unquote, and the gendered body in particular are always at stake. And thus, under such circumstances, the language of the masses cannot but be the language of their daily, practical, even bodily struggle to rehearse and stretch Marx's own formulation from another context against different forms and forces of exploitation and oppression today. Against this background, let me now quickly take up the question towards the end, I think, question of language to account for the significance of our language movement today. In order to do this, I think I would do well to return to a few, within quote marks, third world anti-colonial theorists and writers, including our own, whom I find useful on more scores than one. Now, I entered the second stream of my talk. So here, in decolonizing the mind, the Kenyan writer activist Ngugi wa Thiong'o maintains, I quote, the choice of language and the use to which language is put is central to a people's definition of themselves in relation to their natural and social environment. Indeed, in relation to the entire universe, unquote. Ngugi here does not merely call attention to the choice of a particular language vis-a-vis our struggle for self-definition, but also registers his predilection for the ways in which language is used, or the ways in which language comes to define and determine one's place in the world. In some of his works, Rabindranath Tagore, well before Ngugi, brings up the question of the relationship between being and language in the world, although by no means does Tagore fashion an elaborate ontology of language, nor does he always rigorously dwell on the political dimensions of language from anti-colonial perspectives as such. But it is Qazi Nazrul Islam, an uncompromising anti-colonial revolutionary, one who characteristically moves in the direction of destroying the very prison house of language policed by colonialism, who makes it clear rather repeatedly in his words and his work that language itself is a site of anti-colonial struggle, that language itself turns out to be a form of praxism. In other words, for Nazrul and Ngugi alike, choice is absolutely necessary, but profoundly insufficient. What then is important is the way in which one politicizes one's choice, particularly when one chooses to confront, challenge, and combat the existing systems of oppression, making the point that language relations are also power relations. Language relations are also power relations. Our language movement of 1952 was not simply a struggle for choice. Rather, it was a struggle for self-definition. But no less significantly, it was primarily, if not exclusively, a political struggle of the masses, not only of some students, although they played a crucial and even decisive roles, as I pointed out earlier, for freedom and even emancipation that opened up the possibilities of subsequent mass movements in our part of the world. Umar's, again, I have to mention Umar again because a great deal of my work here is based on Umar's, monumental work on our language movement. So I'm mentioning Umar repeatedly, I know, deliberately. Umar's work in 3 volumes on the language movement of 1952 brings that point home. Now, both Nazrul and Ngugi, while offering their insights into language as a site of struggle, encourages us to make sense of our place and our language in history. Events are the real dialectics of history, as Gramsci would say. Let us then look at that crucial historical event once again, called the Partition of India. The partition was, among other things, of course, a consequence of at least 3 things coming together to constitute a particular historical calculus. Colonialism itself, in the hard political sense, sustained middle-class interests in the shift of power and a decisively unfinished and at least occasionally misdirected struggle against British colonialism at the cultural level. Indeed, the very emergence of Pakistan inaugurated another phase of colonialism in our political history, a point that I already made. One can call it, just to remind you, one can call it internal colonialism, given the very nature of unequal and exploitative relations that obtained between the western and eastern wings of Pakistan. In fact, internal colonialism, variously informing and inflecting those unequal power relations between the two wings, came to influence and even determine the use of language, while producing, reproducing, and reinforcing the divide and distance between the self and the other, between us and them, over the language question itself. Yes, many languages, both Urdu and Bangla, among others, were all used during the Pakistani neo-colonial period. But to put it bluntly, while Urdu in a certain sense became the language of the colonizer for the sheer reason of its power achieved in both economic and political terms, Bangla and other languages, not only Bangla, other languages came to be flagrantly marginalized. In fact, the pronouncement that famous pronouncement, we know this, I mean, it gets quoted quite a bit, you know. The pronouncement that Urdu alone shall be the state language of Pakistan marked a distinct move in the direction of what might be called cultural and linguistic colonialism, almost British style. And what then began as the state language movement in 1952, later it came to be known as the language movement, only marking an extended horizon of engagement, was a movement against, among other things, a particular form of linguistic and cultural colonialism. Let me now quickly make a few points concerning the anti-colonial and essentially political nature of our language movement. To begin with, the Urdu language was not certainly the language of the majority in then Pakistan, but Bangla was. But attempts were made, ineffectively though, to justify the raison d'etre of Urdu as the state language on the ground that it was, within quote marks, superior to Bangla and other languages always already other. In other words, colonialism rhetorical project was also at work. Indeed, colonialism is not just simply coercive. It's also rhetorical in that it reproduces its life, its daily round of living through various means and modes and relations of persuasion. And both the coercive and the rhetorical, enacting their alternate roles, continued to manufacture and package the idea and image of the superior, and the idea of a superior language for that matter. And the idea and the image in question cannot be dissociated from the entire configuration of what might be called colonial epistemic violence, the kind of violence that colonialism perpetrates on the knowledge systems and even languages of the other. Indeed, colonialism, its various modalities of operation notwithstanding, tends to perpetrate violence on the language, land, labor, and body of the other. And historically speaking, one way, not the only way, one way of governing and even disciplining and subjugating the numerically strong other is to undermine it not only at the base, but also at the superstructural level, to weaken it both economically and culturally. As the Caribbean anti-colonial theorist, Frantz Fanon, who influenced Ngugi wa Thiong'o and who would have certainly admired Nazrul had he known Nazrul's work, puts it in his groundbreaking work called Black Skin, White Masks. I began with this particular statement from Frantz Fanon, and let me repeat it. To speak a language is to take on a word, a culture. It was this vital relationship between language and culture that our language movement of 1952 underlined in relation to accentuating other aspects of people's struggles for freedom and emancipation. In 1952, as you all know, protests were made in the streets, although one can surely trace the history of such protests earlier than 1952. And the people had to sacrifice their lives for establishing the right to language and by extension, the right to self-determination. But the cultural issue of colonialism involved in Urdu alone shared with the state language of Pakistan was then being fought primarily at the political level. And this political battle against an already established colonial cultural hegemony was not sufficient, although this battle persisted, remarkably, of course, eventually leading to the emergence of Bangladesh as a geographically independent nation state in 1971. Here, by no means do I mean to undermine or diminish the importance of immediate political struggles for a nation's freedom and liberation, but then a political struggle without its equally strong and organically tied cultural and ideological counterparts can only achieve a limited or virtually no success. Of course, the language movement per se, as an instance, can be invoked today to emphasize, let's say, freedom, democracy, anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and the struggle for establishing people's rights, economic, social, cultural, linguistic, and so on. But then the significance of the language movement needs to be continuously located and relocated in the very world that we inhabit today. And ours is a world, and ours is a country where, linguistically speaking, the gap between English and Bangla persists and even keeps a yawning consequential. I'm not speaking against English, by the way. I'm just trying to point out the actually existing unequal power relations, that obtain, that are there between Bangla and English. Of course, the gap between Bangla and English persists, yes, indeed. And that very gap corresponds precisely to the gap between the privileged few who know or use English and the wretched of Bangladesh, who speak or use Bangla. The ruling class people also use Bangla, but no, I'm not speaking of them. And obviously they do not belong to the wretched in question. The language question in this instance is clearly the class question. I'm not reducing it also to the class question only, but it is significantly a class question. That's what I'm trying to say. Although the former, that's what I say, although the former also ranges beyond the latter. Of course, there exist unequal power relations between what is institutionally and otherwise legitimized as standard Bangla and non-standard Bangla, regional languages, dialects, etc. Something that the Marxist revolutionary Antonio Gramsci theorized in a different context quite some time back. And then, no less significantly, the languages of ethnic minorities in Bangladesh decisively remain the most marginalized languages of the wretched, precisely in the Fanonian sense. Then there are those in our country who continue to celebrate the power, use value, and exchange value of the English language. Of course, English is powerful. It is the language of power, it's the language of capital, it's the language of empire. It can be the language of protest too. I don't deny that either. But we have to also identify, we have to acknowledge that this is the language of power. Some people don't want to pay attention to that aspect of the English language. So they celebrate the English language in the name of globalization, conveniently mystifying the stubborn facts that globalization itself is an euphemism for the current stage of disaster capitalism or catastrophe capitalism, and also digital colonialism, if you will. And Eduardo Galeano has already pointed out that globalization is actually a global learning for the many, that globalization globalizes unequal class relations, unequal race relations, unequal gender relations, and even unequal language relations, as globalization keeps unevenly connecting and interconnecting peoples, places, cultures, and languages across the world. So only connect, but connections themselves are unequal exchanges between the dominant and the dominated, between the oppressor and the oppressed, roughly speaking and broadly speaking. And then there are others in our country, those who even go to the extent of taking pride in asserting that they cannot speak or write in Bangla. And I'm not saying it from any Bengali nationalist chauvinist point of view, but they do take pride, that they cannot speak or write in Bangla, despite their Bangladeshi origin and their prolonged Bangladeshi upbringing. Think of those who can go on and on, talking about all kinds of neat things in world literature and so on and so forth. I mean, let's say even fiction in the Middle East and so on and so forth, but who cannot tell you, for instance, who a Shah Muhammad Sagir is or who a Pagla Kanain is. Such folks, to use Nogugia Thiengo's own language, not my language, Nogugia Thiengo's language, can rightly be regarded as linguistic and literary slaves, masquerading as the educated members of our society. And the lack of knowledge, about their own literature and their own history, they happily show full of themselves as they are, and the choice of language they make are by no means politically, culturally, and ideologically neutral or innocent. Going to time constraints again, well, I've just hitherto dealt with a few issues, providing only a few and even quick examples, but I hope the point comes out clearly. Both our language movement and our liberation movement have remained disastrously unfinished movements that I think have to be rethought, renewed, and even reinvented at this heavily crisis-ridden conjuncture as large-scale political and cultural movements all at once. Such movements will have to confront. We'll have to confront and combat cultural and linguistic colonialism at every turn, whatever its form and force, among other systems of oppression and exploitation. And let us not forget that we live in an era of recolonization, connected as it is today, as it is to today's digital capitalism. Some even call it techno, electro, mediatic, digitalized capitalism. And that what is called national liberation itself needs to be rethought. And that every democratic struggle, what's its name, must be at the same time a decolonization movement. Of course, our mainstream political culture is now totally incapable of addressing the question of decolonization, let alone the larger question of emancipation. So the need for a new politics, is obvious at this point. I think I have run over my time in 3 minutes. 3 minutes more. I've taken 3 minutes more, right? More, like, so I will stop here and thank you. Thank you much for listening. Thank you for your patience. Tosif, can you hear me or?
I do hear you, sir. I'm not sure whether
I have taken 43 minutes. You have given me 40 minutes. You gave me 40 minutes. So.
Yes, I'm not sure whether Professor Afsan Choudhury is here. Yes, he is here.
Yes, he is here. Afsan bhai ki shunte pacchen kina? Tarpore iye chilo.
শুনতে পাচ্ছি।
Oh, good.
Sir, it's.
I think if you said anything in between, I didn't get it. So please say it once more.
No, sir. Azfar sir just concluded his address.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, now thank you, Azfar. That was very illuminating, and I'm sure people will have a lot to say about it. So may I request anyone who would like to speak, be brief, don't give your own impressions just. If you have questions, or make it short, because there will be so many people who will want to speak about it. Right?
Also, there is a.
And if there are students, let the students come first, and then if the faculty members, and the faculty members can then come after the students are finished, sort of. It's the students who need to know. So if there are any students who would like to ask any question.
So RR Bhai is here. RR Bhai jodi kichu bolte chan, please.
RR Bhai eschen ami dekhlam setai.
Ji. No, we'd really appreciate your input. Ji.
Yeah. I think Mr. Yeah.
RR Bhai ki shunte peyechen?
Unmute korte hobe RR Bhai. Ji.
আচ্ছা আমি একটু বিব্রত বোধ করছি এই কারণে যে আমি কিছু বলার জন্য
I think you know a student wants to ask a question.
একটু
জি আর ভাই শেষ করে তারপর আমরা ছাত্র প্রশ্নটা নিতে পারি জি সরি
আচ্ছা আমি ওদেরকে প্রিয়ার করছি আই এম সো সরি আই এম ভেরি এম্বারাসড ইটস আমি সরি সব ছাত্রদের কাছে আমি ক্ষমা প্রার্থী it's always a pleasure to listen to Azfar, so passionate, so inspiring, so articulate. ওরা কিভাবে তাদের মুখে এরকম ফুলঝুরি ঝরে আমি আশ্চর্য হয়ে যাই, বিস্মিত হই। আজকে আমি আর কিছু বলবো না, ছাত্রদের জন্যই এই প্ল্যাটফর্মটা খুলে দেওয়া উচিত। I think I should simply congratulate Azfar on a brilliant presentation and ULAB for organizing this conclave. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Abrar Bhai, and I'm not sure.
Thank you, Abrar Bhai. Students may be feeling a little shy in front of so many faculty members. Okay, if the students are not, we don't have terrible lot of time, so maybe we should ask if anyone has an observation to make on Azfar's presentation. I'm not going to invite anyone because, you know, it's a presentation by itself. So anyone? Azfar, you have overwhelmed people with your presentation. So
have I exhausted the field of the possible? I don't think so. Well, I mean, I made a number of general observations, true, and I was thinking of my time. And so if anybody has any question which has to do with specifying any issue, if you want me to elaborate on any specific issue from my presentation, I would love to do that.
The words of Azfar remain with us. I
certainly cannot hear what's going on. Microphone, a bit of microphone problem.
Many
Tosi,
but
I
those are
can't
not
hear
significant
anything.
that this was a challenge to the conventional. Now, I think we need to recognize that. And language and the, you can't hear anything?
Now I can hear a bit. Yeah, Afsan bhai, I can hear you. Yeah, not very distinctly, but I can
hear me.
Yeah.
We
Can
do
you hear me now?
Sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Azfar, for bringing the most important part of this was to challenge the hegemonic narrative. And I think that is significant. I feel that it is important for us to know the history before 1947 to understand the history. So therefore, we leave out much of the process that 1947 that would help the students and everyone else a lot more. The other final part would be to say that reflecting on historical issues, we also need to take into account there are many kinds of people who are involved in one war and not for the same reason. Just like in 1971, establishment of whichever ideals people were following at a given point of time. With that note, thank you, Azfar, again. As you can see, very positive, the silence itself. And if anyone wants to make any final remarks, sure, go ahead.
Sir, there is an observation in the chat box.
Okay, bring it up.
Okay.
I can't see the question in the chat book. If you think I am so competent about these things, you
No, it's all right. The observation is only an observation by Professor Sabiha Haq. She says, brilliant. I think you have treated the field of the impossible, Professor Azfar Bhai. Can't talk because of the cooking and everything. So that was the comment. Yeah.
Cooking is very important, actually.
Right.
Cooking, so I'm cooking amongst all this, so I know how important cooking is.
Yeah, it is. It itself is a site of struggle, among other things, cooking, you know.
So the $1 million question is, what's cooking?
Right.
And the session is going to be...
I assure you it's a site of struggle.
Well, the relationship between language and cooking itself is quite a kind of language, though. I mean, you know, there are people who have actually likened cooking to, you know, the act of composing a poem or composing a song, things like that, because there you have
the most generous person in the world.
What a session. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Azfar Hussain and Professor Afsan Choudhury for joining us.